The second demand-side policy that we're going to talk about is what's called monetary policy. This is conducted by the central bank of a country. So in the US, this is known as the Federal Reserve. In Europe, it's the European Central Bank. In most countries, it's just the, fill in the name of the country, central bank. Anyhow, this is part of the government, but it's important to understand that the people who conduct monetary policy are different than the people who conduct fiscal policy. Remember, fiscal policy, for the most part, is conducted by the legislature, whoever it is that sets the budget. The central bank, the people who are on what's called the board, are typically appointed to their terms as opposed to being elected. And they're typically not politicians in their background. Typically, they're going to be bankers, economists, people like that. So who they are and what they know and maybe how they approach monetary policy is going to be slightly different for that reason. One last thing is that typically they have a fixed term and they can't be reappointed to their post. We'll talk more about why that's important later on, but for now we'll leave it at that. The jobs of the central bank, the stated jobs, are several. First of all, they're a bank for the government. For obvious reasons, the government can't keep its money in a private consumer bank. So when they get money in or when they pay money out, that's going to come through the central bank of the country. They're also a bank for banks. Banks have this thing called, so when I say a bank for banks, I mean consumer banks or commercial banks, so the banks that businesses and consumers would use. Banks have what's called a reserve requirement. Remember, a consumer bank, they make their money by lending money out and charging interest on it. The more money they can lend out, the more interest they can charge, and the more money or profit they can make. But unfortunately for them, the government requires that they keep a certain amount of money on hand. Imagine if the bank just lent out all your money and you went to the ATM and there was nothing there. Well, you wouldn't put any more money in the bank. So the reserve requirement is the percentage of each deposit that a commercial bank has to hold on to. Usually around 10%, it varies country to country. So when a commercial bank is at their threshold and they don't have any more money to lend out, well, sometimes they'll drop below it because maybe somebody will come make a big withdrawal, or maybe they want to lend money out to somebody. Anyhow, if either of those things happen and they drop below their reserve, they have to borrow money from the central bank to get back up to their reserve. Typically, these loans they're called overnight loans. That's pretty self-explanatory. So they're very short-term loans. Another job of the central bank is to manage the money supply. When we talk about the money supply for this class, we're basically referring to what is called M1. There's also M2 and M3, but you don't need to know about them. What M1 is the parts of the money supply that are very liquid, meaning that they're easy to spend, they're easy to access. Obviously, we're talking about coins, and we're talking about the paper currency of the country, but we're also talking about what's called a demand account or a now account, and that's basically money that is in the bank that I can get to very easily on a debit card, ATM, something like that. So that's what we refer to as M1, and for our intents, for what we're talking about now, you can think of that as the money supply. Okay, so how do they manage the money? So how do they conduct monetary policy? Well, for the most part, they conduct monetary policy by adjusting the size of the money supply. So adjusting how much money is available to the economy. They do this in three ways. These are in order from most commonly used, interest rates, to least commonly used, changing the reserve requirements. They're also in order from the least powerful, the least effective, to the most powerful. The first book that I read when I was just starting to learn about economics was, it referred to the reserve requirements as the nuclear bomb of monetary policy. That always stuck with me. Really powerful, really effective, but that doesn't mean you want to use it because it might be too strong, too effective. Okay, so interest rates for the most part are all we're going to talk about. The discount rate, just so you know, this is the rate that when banks borrow money from the central bank, this is the rate that banks pay to the central bank. The interest rate is referring to the interest paid by consumers or firms to the consumer banks. So, and then the reserve requirement is just to change it, to increase their percentage or decrease their percentage. Okay, so we need to talk about, like I said, interest rates is for the most part the only one we're going to talk about because it's so commonly used. Well, the way this happens is the central bank is going to buy and sell bonds that have already been sold. Now remember, we talked about bonds before when we talked about fiscal policy, that when the government has run a deficit, and remember, the government almost always runs a deficit, that they have to sell bonds to have money to pay off their debts in that fiscal year. So what'll happen is the central bank will buy or sell, depending on if they want to increase or decrease the money supply, bonds, but again, it's bonds that have already been issued. They're not buying them from the federal government. Remember we said that banks, commercial banks, tend to hold a lot of the bonds because they're a very safe investment. So when the central bank buys bonds from a commercial bank, what happens is that, well, there's an exchange, the central bank gets the bond, and in return, the central bank gives to the consumer bank a certain amount of money. That step right there is the important step if you understand that the central bank is not part of G. When we talk about the circular flow, remember that money's kind of coming in, going out, all that. There's a lot of, it keeps making laps around. The central bank, when they do that exchange I just talked about, that money was not previously in the circular flow. It may have just been printed. In most cases, it doesn't even exist. It's just money on it's just digits on a computer screen. But that money is new to the circular flow. The other way they can do it is these bonds that they bought a while back, they can then sell those back into the economy. So they sell them to a commercial bank and get in return for that, they get a certain amount of cash from the commercial bank. Well, likewise, when that money goes from a commercial bank to the central bank, it doesn't then continue to stay in the circular flow. So that's changing the size of the money supply. It's not going to be a now account, demand account. It's not going to be currency or coins. Keep in mind the idea of risk in this. If I'm a consumer bank, well, the least risky thing I can do is to lend money to the government, a bond. The second least risky thing I can do is to lend money to a firm. The most risky thing I can do is lend money to a consumer. So if consumers are the most risky, well, the concept is always risk and reward. So if the bank can lend money to the government at, say, 1% on a government bond, well, to lend it to a consumer, maybe because they're more risky, they have to charge them more to get more reward. So a consumer is going to pay the 1% plus 4% for a total of 5. And the firm is less risky, so they only have to pay 1 plus 2, so 3%. So I have it drawn this way because we need to think about it like, water, and if the level of the water changes, well then the amount that these guys have to pay changes as well. So if the tide comes in and this turns from 1% to 2%, well now firms have to pay 4% instead of 3%, and consumers have to pay 6% instead of 5%. So by changing the interest rate that banks get from the government on government bonds, they change the amount that firms and consumers have to pay, which is obviously going to have an effect on C and on I for aggregate demand. One other thing that is part of this is that interest rates are strongly tied to exchange rates. That is, when interest rates in a country go up, people from other countries want to put their money into banks in the country that we're talking about. That creates more demand for the currency of the country. We'll talk about this more in Unit 3. But essentially, when interest rates go up, exchange rates go up too, and that's going to affect the level of X and M. If the country's currency depreciates, like what's been happening in South Africa over the last 2.5 or 3 years, people talk about this and they think it's really bad, but keep in mind, it makes exported goods cheaper, so there's higher demand for exported goods, so X will go up. And it makes imported goods more expensive, therefore M will go down. Both of those have a positive effect on aggregate demand. Okay, this is going to be basically the mechanism through which central banks, through monetary policy, change the interest rate. First of all, we need to understand what a loan is made up of. A loan has two parts. The principal is the amount that you're borrowing, The interest is the amount you borrow plus the extra that you have to pay. Let's say that an individual firm has 1,000 rupee. And they take those 1,000 rupee, it's cash, and they go put it into the bank. Remember, the bank has to hold on to a certain amount in reserve, in this case 10%, so 100 rupee. The bank's going to turn right around though and lend out that 900 rupee that's left, and maybe that 900 rupee goes to a consumer who takes it to the same business and buys 900 rupee worth of goods and services from it, and then the business takes that 900 and puts it back in the bank. This is how money is created. Sometimes money is printed, but in this process right here, money has been created. We started with 1,000 and the person got 900 more. So if you look at this person's bank account, their bank account says that there's 1,900 rupee in it. But clearly there's not 1,900 rupee because, well, there was only 1,000 to begin with. This process is going to go on and on and on, and this is actually what's called the monetary multiplier. And you take 1 and you divide it by the reserve requirement. In this case, the reserve requirement was 10%, so 1 over 0.10 equals 10. So the injection times the money multiplier of 10 means we have an overall effect or overall growth of the circular flow of 10,000 rupee. So, last thing we need to look at here is what we call the money market. It's just demand and supply, so we're basically going to see the price on the y-axis is the rate of interest that consumers or firms pay. We call the supply curve perfectly inelastic because it is set until the central bank decides to increase or decrease it. So when they increase it or decrease it, the interest rate goes up or down, and obviously that's going to have an effect on investment and on consumption. So if, by buying or selling bonds like we talked about before, if that increases the money supply by 1,000 rupee, remember the overall effect is going to be much greater than that. Typically what the government will do is they will target a certain interest rate, which is to say that they'll keep doing this, they'll keep buying, selling bonds until the interest rate gets to where they want it to be. The reason they have to do that is, keep in mind, the interest rate of a consumer bank is their own interest rate. It's the price of their product. So the government can't just call them up and say, hey, here's your new interest rate. Not in most democratic societies. So basically the government is going to fiddle with the money supply until the interest rate becomes what they want it to be. This whole process is also known as open market operations, which gives away the fact that basically the government is using the market for money to get the desired effect. Last two terms, when we talk about easy monetary policy, it's basically the exact same as expansionary fiscal policy. So this would happen during a contraction. Interest rates are going to be low, therefore aggregate demand is going to increase. We'll get the effects we want. The opposite of that is tight monetary policy, where interest rates will be high and aggregate demand is going to decrease. Remember, it's probably not going to decrease, it's probably just not going to, we're going to limit how much it increases. We're going to slow it down a little bit. The effects of this, obviously, just aggregate demand and aggregate supply. If we move from 1 to 2, GDP is going to go down, as will price levels. And if we go from aggregate demand 2 to 1, well, then GDP is going to increase and price levels are going to come up. If you have any questions, leave a comment below.